Welcome to the webinar on micromobility, equity, and sustainability. We will start in a few minutes. We're just waiting for all of the participants to join us today. Again, welcome everyone. My name is Tatiana Samsonova. I'm a policy analyst at the International Transport Forum, and I will be moderating this webinar today. So what will happen in the next 90 minutes? I will start with a short presentation of main highlights of the recently published report on micromobility. To reflect on these recommendations, we'll continue with a panel discussion between our distinguished experts who participated in the roundtable on which this report is based. So I'm here with me, I have joining me Sebastian Schlabusch, Head of Market Development at DOT, Niels Fearnley, Chief Researcher at Institute of Transport Economics, Norway, and Maria Fernanda Rivera, General Director of Road Safety and Sustainable Urban Mobility, Mexico City. Thank you very much, Sebastian, Niels, and Maria, for joining this event, for participating and contributing to the roundtable. And thanks a lot to all of the participants for connecting in and listening. We had around 130 participants registered, and I was delighted to see some familiar names on the list. Welcome again. Just before I start, a few rules. We are doing this in the webinar format, but we're still trying to connect and interact with the audience. So during my presentation and throughout panel discussion, I do encourage you, and please do feel free to send us questions by Q&A box. You can also use a thumbs up function. If you click on it, if there's a question that you like, it will allow this question to pop on the top of the list. I'll try to pick up as many as possible, and we together with our experts will try to answer as many as possible. Now, with no further ado, I'll start with the presentation of the report. So this work is an outcome from a roundtable discussions between policymakers, academics, industry representatives that took place back in December. So over the course of 3 days on Zoom, we asked the group a very simple question, so what do we do with this new micromobility thing? How to get the regulatory framework right? And the starting point is that everyone agrees that regulation is needed, but the question is in what form? So the starting point is that, the starting point of the discussion was that in the last 2-3 years, we saw sort of very different approaches to regulation of micromobility. E-scooters were particularly controversial. Many city officials, we saw that many city officials associated the emergence of these new services with the previous experience with the ride sourcing, but also first generation of dockless bike share that was flooding the streets, and city officials had to deal with it. Hence, some cities decided to put in place strict regulations or bans on new mobility services. Other cities welcomed this new shared micromobility services, yet we see that some rules have been changing and everyone has been going through this period of trial and error and learning from experience and learning from each other. But the starting question is, in general, why should cities want micromobility, and what are the benefits and what are the costs of these services? Now, from what we know so far, and there is much more that needs to be done in terms of research in the area, but the biggest benefit of micromobility in cities is this ability to replace car trips. The substitution effect will arise between different cities, between different countries. Already now we see in research that these numbers can go as high as 45% in very car-oriented cities across the Atlantic in the US. In dense, less car-oriented European cities, the substitution effect is between 2 and 10%, but even this may already have a significant impact on traffic, on air quality, and have significant benefits. What's more, micromobility bikes and e-scooters are just faster, especially in congested environment, not to mention they're just way more fun. Second important benefit of micromobility is that it can serve as a first last mile solution. It may help improve access to areas that are now lacking access to public transport, increase catchment of public transport, which also may make public transport itself more competitive vis-a-vis car. Thirdly, micromobility is one of the most space efficient modes, and I'm going to talk about it later on. And finally, research shows that there are specific environmental benefits of micromobility that are way bigger compared to other modes. Now, we also do need to acknowledge that there are specific costs, there are specific negative externalities that do need to be addressed. One of the key problems, one of the key initial concerns has been cluttering and improper parking, especially when scooter companies first launched on city sidewalks. Consumers didn't know where to park, how to park, and this had a significant effect on pedestrians and particularly on elderly people and people with reduced mobility. Now, safety concerns have been also highlighted, in particular related to riding on sidewalks and conflicts with different modes, in particular with pedestrians. And finally, one of the points that has been highlighted in the research as well is that there are specific health implications related to substitution effect of walking and cycling, and we do acknowledge that in many instances, micromobility substitute for walking and cycling, which may have significant impacts on physical activity, hence in general on health. All right. Now we've been talking about just simply benefits and costs of micromobility itself, but we do need to acknowledge and we do need to think about micromobility as part of generally mobility mix and put those benefits and costs into perspective and see how they are relative to other modes. There are several dimensions that are discussed in the report itself. We talk about space consumption, we talk about environmental performance and safety. Here in my presentation, I'm going to just focus on one of my favorite topics, that is space. Then you can discover other points in the report, and ITF has done more detailed work on those points as well. When it comes to here, you can see this quite complicated graph with a lot of squares and graphics. But the point that we're trying to make is that in terms of space consumption, there are two modes that are most space efficient. Those are public transport and different forms of micromobility, and obviously walking, if we consider walking as a transport mode. Yet still, a lot of our cities have been built around cars, and car travel in terms of space allocated to this mode is usually unfairly advantaged. I'll give you some numbers. For instance, in Paris, cars occupy around 50% of public space, roads and parking included, even though private cars account for only 13–15% of total number of journeys in Paris. And if we compare mode share with the space that is occupied by other modes, we do see that cars are indeed unfairly advantaged in that sense. And now coming back to the questions of costs that were discussed before related to safety, riding on sidewalks, cluttering, improper parking, to a large extent, those costs reflect a fundamental deficiency of many cities' infrastructure that for decades prioritized cars at the expense of other modes. And then some interesting numbers from a research that has been presented at the roundtable. Anne Brown from Oregon University did observational research concluding that, especially when we look in the question of parking and improper parking, we do need to put micromobility in perspective. Her observational research shows that only in less than 1% of instances, microvehicles have been parked incorrectly, compared to 25% when it comes to cars. Now, yet again, just to mention that there are other dimensions that are discussed in the report, including environmental performance of micromobility in comparison with other modes. Similarly, the report touches upon the questions of safety. But I will now shift to the discussion of recommendations and what should be done so that micromobility, what should cities consider so that micromobility becomes part of sustainable mobility mix. The starting point is that we do need to acknowledge that there are benefits to micromobility services, and that we do need to facilitate service availability across urban areas. And importantly, we do need to support integration with public transport, but we cannot necessarily wait for micromobility to solve all of the city problems. It cannot on itself solve car dependency. So it is important to the problems that need to be dealt outside of this regulatory realm of micromobility needs to be dealt outside of this realm of regulation of micromobility. What we mean is that there are needs for a broader fiscal policies to contain car traffic if that is the problem. Now, another point that I've been talking over and over again, many issues that cities are facing now are not necessarily about regulation per se, but rather about providing space to these modes. For instance, we do see cities, for instance, like Paris, that converted car parking spaces that translated into 2,500 dedicated parking bays. And as reported by DOT, micromobility operator, this, along with in-app enforcement, actually increased parking compliance from 35% in 2019 to 97% in 2020, which are quite impressive numbers. So this means that not only parking, but also road space that will increase safety and perception of safety when riding the services, and may solve the problems of riding on sidewalks and conflicts with other modes. Now, what we also see is that there are more and more examples of cities where micromobility companies and city officials are actually trying to work together to establish this consensus and to make it. This is not what we saw during roundtable discussions, that at this stage, this is not necessarily a war between micromobility companies and city officials, but rather both stakeholders are trying to get into dialogue in order to set up regulations that would work for all parties, but essentially will benefit the users. And those examples of cities, for instance, London and Paris, have proven quite successful. Now, one of the key concerns that cities have been facing, one of the key problems, has been oversupply of micro vehicles on the streets. And as a solution, the traditional model that has been used was to set a fixed fleet cap from the outstart. And sometimes the number of vehicles that is allowed to be deployed is extremely low. And we do need to acknowledge that for micromobility systems to function, they do need sufficient availability of vehicle throughout the city so that it can become a reliable transport mode. We do want to find it in e-scooter or bike or in e-bike 2 minutes from where we're walking, not to walk for 20 minutes to find it. And for that, it does need to be available across the urban area. So one of the idea that has been already out there, that one of the ways to increase the availability of scooters without necessarily facing a surplus of unused scooters on sidewalks is to simply increase supply based on demand. So instead of imposing fixed caps on the number of scooters or bikes each company can deploy, we suggest that cities should use so-called dynamic caps, for instance, based on utilization rates. So, for instance, as long as each scooter is used a certain number of times per day, then operators are allowed to increase the number of scooters in the fleet in the next month. Similarly, different indicators, different performance indicators like parking compliance can be used also to adjust the number of micro vehicles that can be deployed on the streets. For that to happen, there obviously needs to be a set of rules related to data reporting. However, here we do need to be wary that micromobility is digital, hence it is easy to measure. And cities do need to take into account and cities do need to understand what data they actually need, what data will be used for and in which form, not necessarily ask operators for all sorts of data about everything, but rather simply understand what is the objective for the use of the data. And then again, just because data can be extracted, there is a risk of asymmetric regulation. Therefore, we do need to think about how much other modes are actually reporting in terms of data. Finally, a few points. Cities also do need to consider that running the services may be extremely costly. And in some instances, those costs are high, but then additional, on top of that, some cities are imposing additional fees. The justification for that is that cities do need to run an administrative program to run this, to run the program related to micromobility, which is very reasonable. However, those costs need to be evaluated because we do see that in some instances, the fees that are imposed on micromobility companies are way higher compared to administrative costs. And then here's also the question, how much do other modes pay compared to the space that they actually require? So this is something that needs to be carefully monitored and carefully evaluated. Finally, also related to a previous point, some cities limit service areas for micromobility companies to operate. Yet, if we're talking about the role of micromobility to improve accessibility, we do need to ensure that exactly in the areas that are lacking access, in the areas that are actually lacking access now, these services need to be provided. And in some instances, there is a case to suggest that these services could be subsidized, especially in undeserved areas where operations are unprofitable, where ridership is lower, and where operational costs are significant. That's my final slide to conclude. Once again, this is something from this is the point from which I started. We do, during the discussions, we did all agree that yes, regulation is needed, but there should be also room for micromobility companies to grow, to compete, and to innovate. Cities do need also to provide some sort of visibility longer term so that micromobility companies can adjust accordingly to potential changes in rules. And yet again, one of the key points here is that consultation and cooperation between micromobility companies and city officials is extremely important in that sense. I will stop talking on that. There are additional resources related to the presentation. Please do go check it out. There are additional discussion papers that were published. You can also see all of the presentations that took place during the roundtable. A few publications related to the topics that I've been talking about. In 2020, ITF published a report on safe micromobility, and then evaluation of environmental performance of different shared mobility modes. Also do look at it. Thank you very much. Please do feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions, if there are some unanswered questions today. And with that, I'll shift to panel discussion. Yet again, thank you to all of the experts that are joining me today. We have Sebastian Schlebusch, Head of Market Development at DOT, Niels Finley, Chief Researcher at Institute of Transport Economics in Norway, and Maria Fernanda Rivera, General Director of Road Safety and Sustainable Urban Mobility in Mexico City. I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see everyone. All right, thank you very much again. I'll start with before I take a look at the chat, I see there are already some questions and in the Q&A box. But before that, I'll start with a question to Fernanda, because she may be leaving us soon. But Fernanda, thank you very much for joining. I've been wondering, I've been wondering, in the case of Latin American cities and Mexico City in particular, for you, what has been the most problematic aspect when it comes to emergence of this new micromobility market?
Hi, everyone, and thank you. I'm sorry that I have to leave soon, but I think that's something that's really important about the region in Latin America is that the companies and the cities have to deal with the robbery of the units, of the micromobility units. So that was a big issue because even though they deployed thousands of units on the streets, a lot of people started like take them to their houses, and now we have private scooters in the city. And another thing that was really interesting for us is that in other countries, the companies usually accomplish all the rules that they get established on. And in Mexico City, they tried to avoid several rules that we thought that were exactly the same rules that they had in Paris or they had in London, but they made a lot of efforts to not accomplish them. So it was like really hard to realize these two things, no? That the region, they had stolen bikes or scooters. And the second thing is that they didn't want to make a full accomplishment of the rules that the city established. And that's something that we learned. The problem that we have right now is that we only have one company, one bike company that's still operating, that it's a Mexican company that is called Desva. And we have opened for proposals for new companies and we didn't have any good answers. So hopefully they will come back to the region and realize that here in Latin America, we're really keen on having more bikes, and that maybe we're open also as Mexico City government to cooperate with them and to have these regulations that could be worked well jointly between us.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. Before you go, I'm going to ask you another question that I think is very interesting and very important. So one of the things that we have been talking about was this role of micromobility to sort of unlock public transport as a first and last mile solution. But we saw that in the case of Mexico City, micromobility companies and DESBA, for instance, is not authorized to operate in areas that are actually lacking public transport. So could you please explain what are the key reasons for that? Is it related to the fact that those devices are being stolen in those areas? And are there any further plans to expand authorization of service provision to these areas?
Actually, what we realized is that even though we opened the area where they could operate, they concentrated in the higher income zones. Maybe it might be this market idea that you will sell and have more trips, but we actually allowed the companies to operate in several areas in Mexico City that are not the most high income zones or the most attractive touristic zones. And we saw that they had to operate just in these areas that concentrate the higher number of trips and the higher number of tourist spaces. And so we don't really have an answer. I think that it's market oriented, the decision of the area they operate, rather than a consideration of public transit, for example.
Sorry for interrogating you, Fernando, but there is another question in the chat box. The question is, who in Mexico City didn't want to follow the rules? Is it the users or the operators?
It was an operator. It was Mexico City's mobile. They decided not to pay the fees that they offered to pay the city. We'll explain really fast how we opened. We made a tender process where every company decided how many units they could operate and they wanted to pay for each unit. And they had to pay that permit for the city to have an annual allowance to operate. And afterwards, the company decided to offer as amount of money that they will pay to the city's taxes. They didn't pay and they were operating illegally. So it was really surprising for us because we realized that they like repeated these patterns that we have in Latin America of companies that do not respect the rules. And the other companies, for example, Desba, Bird, Jump, Green, that they were operating accordingly to the law, they were really like mad because you have a company that it's illegal and you have a market share that it was not paying the permit in the city. So that was a big issue for us to realize that in the region, they didn't want to follow up the rules.
All right, thank you very much, Fernanda. I understand that you should be going soon to catch the plane. Thank you again very much for joining this. Now, coming back to something that Fernando already mentioned about, let's say, behavior of micromobility operators. Sebastian, I'll refer to you. I'm wondering, traditionally in many cities, we saw that micromobility companies would sort of opt for this ask for forgiveness, not for permission approach. Which leaves regulators making rules long after there's the fleet is already deployed. Yet this didn't benefit cities, it didn't benefit operators nor the users. Do you think that having learned from this experience, now the approach is changing towards, let's first discuss with city officials what works, what doesn't? And what happens, how do you go about places from the micromobility operator's perspective, where cities are actually reluctant to consider potential benefits that micromobility can bring?
Yeah, multifaceted question. Hello, everyone, first of all. I'd say right now you still see a whole range of attitudes amongst companies. No? Sometimes even differentiating between markets within a company. So some operators, they have aspects such as responsibility and the partnership approach with cities really woven into their DNA. While others, these aspects are sometimes fig leaves and they're trying to keep the market as unregulated and open as possible, not to disturb their business model. And yeah, I think in our experience, the cities very much appreciate if operators engage early to understand their particular issues, well, also to discuss the operators' visions for the city and also tailored to the city. You shouldn't just come with a one-size-fits-all approach, a copy-paste one-to-one the service design to a new city, but rather work with dialogue with the city stakeholders to achieve the best results and to understand the local pain points, how to unfold the value of micromobility. And there are some cities, and especially the big ones, Paris, London, but also some smaller cities like Aachen in Germany or Monza in Italy, which are very engaged, which have built dedicated internal resources to monitor and manage the schemes, which engage on a regular basis and proactively with operators. And yeah, this leads to an overall better situation. While others, and I don't want to name drop city names here, they are sometimes driven by public perception, and sometimes the public perception is driven by naysayers, by traditionalists, and where we also see that on the officers level, the mobility specialists, they have in general, they tended towards a more positive view on micromobility and they see the value by and large. Whereas on the political level, yeah, this many other sentiments play a role here, and that's difficult to argue them.
All right, thank you very much, Sebastian, for your answer. You mentioned that, and this is something that we try to cover in the report, when it comes to benefits and costs of micromobility, how do we communicate those? Nils, I will refer a question to you. How can we better communicate what are the costs and what are the benefits of micromobility? Obviously, in your work, you've seen quite a lot of research on the topic, and there are obviously questions. There are obviously this case study, that case study, but how do we put it all together, and how do we come to this conclusion as to how huge are the benefits, how huge are the costs, and how do we communicate that? What's your take on this?
Well, thank you, and hello everyone. I think the benefits are quite visible on the streets. People use e-scooters, so the proof really lies in the pudding, or the eating of the pudding. So people love them and they use them a lot. And they also pay the full cost of provision. So in general, there is no subsidies. And I believe also, as your roundtable report demonstrates, that most city governments and local authorities are quite positive and see benefits, and even more, they see potential future benefits from e-scooters. And when we ask users why they choose to use an e-scooters, they say that it's because it's the fastest alternative, it's most flexible, and it's fun. So the benefits are, I mean, they're visible, and they can be communicated more maybe. But with regards to the problems, I think that's more tricky, because the debate is so heated and there's so much noise, and it's difficult to judge the size of the problem, really. So there needs to be more general studies, or like general population, like whether they have experience and to what degree they experience the problems themselves. For example, there's a lot of outcry about pedestrian safety, and if one scooter runs down a pedestrian, it easily reaches like the national headlines. Whereas when we get data from the ICU unit, like the emergency medical care, the data suggests that this is a limited problem. It's not non-existing, but it's limited. So I believe that there is a very urgent need to demonstrate the facts and figures behind this, and like you said, you showed on your presentation as well, what are the myths and what are the facts. And I think also one aspect to this is the fact that the industry is young and it is developing fast. So facts and findings, they become outdated very quickly. So what we know about the industry today will be outdated next year. And one example of that is like the discussion of the life cycle emissions of scooters, where opponents who want to discredit e-scooters usually refer to 2019 life cycle analysis, which is completely outdated. There are newer and better sources for this, including the ITF report, Good to Go. So I think, like, to conclude, there are lots of myths, and there is a need to debunk them or to update them. And institutions like my research organization and the ITF, we have an important role in producing and communicating neutral and updated information about the benefits as well as the problems. So that will be my long answer to that.
Thank you very much, Nils. That's excellent. Just before I come to the next question, I would like to ask all of the attendees, if you have any questions whatsoever, please do feel free to ask them via Q&A box. We'll try to answer as many as possible. We already have one I'm going to ask now. So the question is, have you found that micromobility has a sustainable business case? Nils mentioned that the full cost is being borne by the users, no subsidy, but isn't VC funding part of the reason micromobility services are currently funded as affordably as they are? I think, Sebastian, you'll be the best person to answer that.
Yes, so micromobility has a positive business case. Not everywhere and for everyone, but by and large, the industry is turning into profitability, and that's very 2, 3, 4 years after establishing the companies. But we see also that users are paying right now the full price of the service, and if you compare it to public transport, often still it's not price competitive. And if we want to ensure that everyone will benefit from micromobility, even low-income people, even inhabitants of the outer peripheral areas in the cities where profitability of micromobility service is not so guaranteed, then we should start having the discussion as well. Which trips are desirable from a public objective perspective, and how do we support those? And that's where also with profitable businesses, we can manage market dynamics.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for answering that. Now, coming back to the questions that I had, we saw recently that there were some developments, in particular in Oslo, where the regulations of e-scooters have been updated, and I think that it's an interesting example to discuss. So basically, in Oslo, there is the number of e-scooters has been limited from 25,000 to 8,000, which is now spread among 12 operators. There's also a curfew. So Nils, you being quite aware of all of those changes, could you please discuss a little bit what could be the key implications of these changes, and to what extent, in your view, this is an optimal way to regulate the sector?
Yeah, I can give it a try. I think for those who don't know the Oslo case, it has been quite an extreme case globally, because we haven't had any regulation at all. Scooters can drive on pavements, in parks and streets and everything, and the city council has not, for legal reasons, been able to set any rules of the game. So the situation has been quite chaotic, and I think globally, I saw some statistics that we are we used to be way ahead of any other city when it comes to like availability, the number of scooters per inhabitant. I think it was something like 300 per 10,000 inhabitants. And now that 2/3 of them have been banned, so we went from about 25,000 to about 8,000. Oslo is still one of the cities in Europe with the highest number of e-scooters per capita. So there was certainly an acute need for something to happen, a regulation. But having said that, Oslo was so eager to regulate once they had got the powers that they acted in a hurry, and the current regulation has several flaws and shortcomings, which they are partly aware of, and which are partly debated, and it will be improved hopefully from next year on. But one major problem is that they say a maximum number of 8,000 scooters is allowed, but they shall be shared equally between all operators that fulfill quite simple criteria. So now we have 12 operators, and each of them have the same mediocre service of about 600, 700 scooters each. And they can't really compete on what is important for competition, which is availability. And there are very strong signs of scale economies in this market from the producer side, of course, but importantly in this context is the demand side economy of scale, that users, the public, they have enjoy more benefit from a larger operator than a small one, because the larger one will be more available shorter distance to the nearest vacant scooter and so on. But now it's divided by 12 equally poor services, and many people have commented that was very unfortunate. And the other question is about night closure. Now, currently, with the new regulation, scooters shall be closed or shut down between 11 p.m. and I can't remember, 6 a.m. or
5
something.
a.m.
5 a.m. Yeah,
thanks.
That's another good question, because accident risks are extremely high on e-scooters in general, and in particular during nighttime, and even more so during Friday night and Saturday night, when evidence proves that there is a lot of drink driving and driving under the influence of various drugs. So the accident risk is extremely high during nighttime. and it's irresponsible for a city to let that happen. But now that they just close the service during night, I think that's a very blunt, very static regulation, because the city could have challenged the industry to find better solutions, smart solutions, so that people who need the transport service during night can have this as an alternative, because there are no nighttime public transport usually in Oslo. So I think they many people ask for, like, why couldn't we use all the new and interesting ways to improve the safety matters? There are alternatives like virtual, what do you call it? Machine learning, various way to detect dangerous driving that can slow down or even stop the scooter. You can have slow speed hours during the day or during the week, and like only our imagination can really set the limit to like the number of things that could have been tested, but now we don't know if that could have worked or not. So I believe when it comes to safety, that nighttime bans might be the last resort solution, because it is acute and it is a serious problem. But on the way to there, we have missed out the opportunity to find much more intelligent and smart ways to address the traffic safety problems. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Niels, for your elaborate answer. Just to add up to that, I do think personally that from a user perspective, having 12 different apps on your phone and trying to figure out where to find a scooter or a bike takes a lot of time. So it only translates into this inconvenience to users. But just following up on that question of how many vehicles, how many micro devices are allowed to be on the streets. Sebastian, I recall during your presentation at the roundtable, you had some estimates as to how cities should evaluate based on density, based on different indicators, how cities should evaluate the number of vehicles that should be allowed initially on the street. And I think that this is one of the key problems, because now cities are putting these arbitrary caps that I'm not sure are based on what type of indicators. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about from your perspective, how cities should define the number of micro vehicles that should be allowed on the streets.
Yeah, if I would give a recommendation for a city who doesn't have micromobility service in its market yet and is about to set up a local regulation, I would definitely advise to go progressively. Start not too big in the beginning, but rather adapt with over time and with the demand, just to ensure that the people also get to use to this new service and new function within the public realm. But of course, a lot of cities already have services at hand and are now looking to find the optimal equilibrium between the supply and demand. And here we at DOT, we've built an internal model to assess the optimal fleet size in our cities, and this takes into account not only the population or certain density, but also we're looking at the addressable population. So we're looking at the population between different age groups. We're looking at the inbound tourist flow, the inbound commuting flow, the share of time there, on average spending time in the city. We're also factoring in the historical demand, so to have this flexibility and adaptive element to it, because nothing is worse than just a hard cap, because that doesn't address the needs to remain flexible. And if the operators can demonstrate that there is higher demand beyond a certain thresholds, 2-3 trips a day, this could justify generally a fleet increase. On the other hand, of course, in winter times, also decrease. But the demand is only one key. The other thing is also the parking capacity. Of course, if this model would say, in an ideal perspective, the city of Oslo should have 8,000 or 10,000 scooters, but then does it have the space to allocate it already to provide proper parking? Right now, I'm not so confident that this this is the case. Like in Paris, it is the case. The 2,500 parking spots have a capacity of around about 30,000 scooters. We have 15,000 scooters in the city. So there's, apart from maybe some hotspot areas at very particular times of the day, there's always an empty space available, unless it's parked with cars, which also happens, which is an issue. Yeah, sometimes the dedicated micromobility spaces are even taken and blocked by other vehicles. Yeah, I think there is a data-driven methodology we can apply, and we have now a lot of data available from a variety of cities. We have specialized data services who can give all the insights. So I think before setting an arbitrary cap and just putting the finger in the air, it's wise to get consultation and apply suitable number here.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Now there are a few questions in the Q&A box and in the chat that I'll try to kind of link. First, just a small precision. Nils, maybe you can talk a little bit about the evidence related to mode shift from Oslo e-scooter riders. You are muted.
Sorry. Well, we don't have very updated data on this, but we conducted some surveys last year. And the thing about Oslo is that our current government has an ambition to make the city center car free. So car is really not an alternative for people who move around in city center. So that's like the context of it. And when we asked them how they would have made the trip if it wasn't for the e-scooter, a large majority said they would have walked. So the typical pattern would be that people travel by public transport to city center, and in city center they take an e-scooter instead of walking the last mile. And the further quarter or so said that they would have used public transport, and only very small shares, less than 10%, would have generated a car trip. So that's the overall response to those questions. But when we asked them how they use e-scooters, more than half of them said that they use an e-scooter in combination with another mode, and almost entirely by public transport. So they use, lots of users see the e-scooter as a first or last mile alternative, which is it can be good for health and for keeping car traffic down. And when we frame the question differently, we ask them, like, have you changed anything as a result of e-scooters? What people say they have changed the most is the use of taxis. And a quite substantial, I think about 1/4 of our respondents say that they spend more time outdoors as a result of the e-scooter. So the question, the way we answer the question depends really on the framing, and it can be framed as a very positive contribution to the transport system, or it can be, of course, seen as a mode which only replaces walking. I think the challenge in cities like, well, most European cities really, where car use is not really very attractive, is to regulate the e-scooter market such that they are located in zones of the city which are more car-based, and where it's more probable that they will replace car use. So I think zoning is one part of the solution to making them more in direct competition with car.
Thank you very much, Nils. And then there's just a very interesting comment in the chat, and something that we also discussed within ITF internally with my colleagues. And that is the question of how, when we talk about regulation, we talk about shared e-scooters, but also how do we take into account private bikes and private e-scooters, especially when it comes to question of speed limits and safety. What do we do about private ones, and how do we kind of frame the discussion when we talk not only about when there is no such thing as asymmetric regulation that is being imposed on micromobility companies, when users of private bikes or private e-scooters are misbehaving, if you will?
Did you want me to answer that?
Well, if you can.
Well, yeah, I can try to say something at least. And I think some of the most successful countries like England have succeeded because e-scooters have been banned from the outset and then only allowed as trial schemes and shared e-scooters. And in that way, there is very little like illegal scooters that can go extremely fast or something like that, or without. I mean, all legal e-scooters in England have brakes and lights and all that. They work perfectly. So that's really one part of the challenge between privately owned and shared ones. Whereas parking is like not a problem at all with private bikes or e-scooters, because they're difficult to lock. People carry them indoors, take them into their office and so on. So the approach needs would be different between privately owned and shared ones. And also, as you probably had in mind, that geofencing, for example, is impossible for privately owned e-scooters. So then the alternative would be to have lots of signs in the street about slow speeds and all that. So that makes it difficult to regulate them in a very similar way. When you relate it to bicycling and whether you treat them differently or favor one mode, I think that depends very much on the national legislation. Some countries, they have made e-scooters like on similar terms as bicycles, like in legal terms. So whenever a bicycle is allowed, an e-scooter is also allowed. And whereas other countries have made e-scooters a separate vehicle type with its own requirements and age limits and helmet requirements and all that. So I think that question will differ from country to country. That will.
Yes, thank you very much, Nils. It makes a lot of sense, and I do agree with you on that. But coming back to the question of requirements on the national level, there is a question in Q&A box, and maybe Sebastian, you can give your view on that. The question is, with much of the micromobility riding taking place in urban areas, what are your thoughts on the need for licensing people to ride these devices, especially minimum age requirements, for instance? I think Sebastian lost his connection. So I'll refer, Nils, I'll refer this question to you again. And I'll answer some of it myself afterwards.
Yeah, it's a tricky question about well, age limits. Hello, Sebastian.
Yeah, I'm trying to connect, but sometime I don't hear.
Might as well turn off your video, I think.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so my view on licenses. So there are some examples now in the UK. There's a mandatory, at least temporary driving license requirement, which I think it excludes quite a lot of people who don't have any driving license, and I know that a car driving license is necessarily the right thing to have to use micromobility devices. When it comes to an age restriction, I mean, we all, as the operators, we all have terms and conditions where you are supposed to ride at the age of 18 or higher. So from a legal perspective, it could make sense to have age requirements, but it needs to be enforced across all operators. I think there is a certain value of making this mandatory to come as a requirement here. And I think what's also the theoretical knowledge of how.
I think we're losing Sebastian on his answer, but we got some of it. Just to finish off, if
now we lost you as well, Tatjana.
I was just muted. So I think that we lost Sebastian at some point. In this case, I will just ask if kind of a final question to Niels. And the question would be, just in general, how do you see the sector evolving, and what do you see will be happening in the years to come with the micromobility industry?
Yeah, I think the industry itself presents a very impressive, innovative force. It's just the 3-4 years since they first came into cities and started to operate, and already now we see so much innovation. I mean, you can tell from the vehicles that they're more safe, they're more longer lives, everything has improved, but also behind the scene, like the logistics and the organization, the apps, everything is improving so much, and I believe that that's going to continue for several years to come. Well, we can only guess in what directions, but I guess companies will try to stand out, like go in different directions so as to win different market segments. They will try out complementary services. They will add ride hailing to their scooter. They will you can only think that there will be a lot of innovation in many aspects. But I think that what now stand out as the most important areas for improvement, like from a societal point of view, that is related to littering, bad parking, and accidents and traffic safety, and those are areas where I don't see that the market will find its own good solutions, and that's why I see a very important role for, in particular, local authorities to regulate and to make companies improve in those aspects. They can compete on finding the best solutions to littering or to traffic safety, and only the best candidates will win contracts to operate cities. Because both the littering and the accidents, they're externalities. So I think there is a very important role for authorities to steer this innovative force. I mean, use it for what it's worth. Set very strict requirements, challenge them, specify the problems that are needed to be solved, and let them come up with innovative new solutions to them, rather than specifying very technical solutions, like this bike should have a double stand so as not to fall, for example. Then there is no more room for innovation with regards to that particular problem of bicycles lying around. And I think in order to reach, I mean, to succeed in that, cities and authorities will benefit a lot from cooperation, from sharing experience with what kind of regulation, what kind of requirements were successful, which are not so successful. And I think there's a desperate need for more research, which is not surprising. I'm a researcher, but there's still so many unknowns in this market, and the cities struggle. I mean, it's like they have their eyes blinded, and they don't know, they have no idea how to solve or how to address the problems they struggle with. So to exchange experience, form umbrella organizations like the American, I think it's called NACTO, like transport something authorities, together and the exchange. So I think there will be a lot more innovation in general. There will be new types of vehicles, new types of services added to what we already see. And I think that authorities have a particularly central role in steering this innovative force in the right directions, so as to relieve and make the public benefit happen.
Thank you very much, Niels, for your reply. I can only echo that. I feel like you very briefly summarized the conclusions of the report that we have just published. Thank you very much for that, because we do agree on the side of International Transport Forum that it's obvious that authorities do play a central role in addressing and helping to address negative externalities related to emergence of the services. But there needs to be space for these companies to innovate and to compete, to innovate by competition, and this needs to be kind of taken into account when we think about how to regulate micromobility market. We secured a little bit more time for a webinar, 30 minutes more, but I think with everyone losing connection and taking flights, we're going to wrap up on that. Unfortunately, Sebastian lost his connection, but I will still thank him for his participation. Thank you very much, Niels. Everyone who is listening in, please do feel free to reach out in case you have any additional questions. I hope you enjoyed last hour of this discussion. Thank you very much again, and enjoy your day, your evening, or your morning, wherever you are. Thank you.